Hello and welcome to Shaking and Sipping. This is the show where we shake up or stir a cocktail or other mixed drink, talk about its history, some variants, have a sip, and see how it is. We're continuing our quest to work through the IBA's official list of cocktails to see how those stack up. We're in the second section, the Contemporary Classics, and this is the final drink on the Contemporary Classics list. This week's drink is the Zombie. Just kidding, we had a musical themed episode last week, so that's all you're going to see of that in this week's episode. Just couldn't resist a quick Cranberries reference. Alright, so the Zombie is an interesting drink, but a drink without a lot of sort of deep history behind it. We know who created it, we're pretty sure what year it was created. There's a couple different stories of how it was created, probably none of which are really true. It's not a simple drink per se, but there's just not much that's happened in the evolution of the drink either. So let's just jump right into it. We've mentioned before, it was probably in the Mai Tai episode, Don the Beachcomber, Don Beach, whose name was actually Ernest Gant, I believe. And he's a fascinating figure. He's essentially the father of sort of tiki drinks and sort of the tiki culture that sprung up in the, late 30s, but really big into the 40s and 50s. He's one of those guys who both really did do a ton of fascinating stuff and was entirely full of shit. So it's very difficult to tell anything about this guy. He was born in New Orleans, except for the fact that he was probably born in Texas, and then he grew up in Texas and New Orleans and Jamaica, and maybe on some other Caribbean islands, or maybe also not. And then he went around the world, or maybe he was just captaining like a cargo boat, and then he captained some yachts, maybe, and then he went around the world again, maybe, and eventually he went off to World War II. That part actually happened, and came back, and just nothing about the guy like lines up. Like his restaurants, which we're going to discuss in a moment, when he got divorced from his first wife, you'll read an article about him and it'll be like, they remained friends and she ran the restaurants after they divorced. And then like the very next line is like, he was unable to open the new restaurant he wanted because his divorce settlement said that his wife had pure ownership of everything to do with those, and so he had to go to like another country. It's like, well, none of that really lines up. Those two things are completely contradictory. But anyway, he had this crazy life, ended up living out his later years on like a houseboat that he was trying to get built into like a development of houseboats in Hawaii that never got approved, and then he ended up bouncing around with that and eventually got destroyed by a hurricane and just crazy stuff. But anyway, sometime in the 30s, he possibly owned a restaurant that I believe was called Ernie's Place. This is when he was still known as Ernest. And this was either a bar, it was either like a restaurant, or maybe it was actually a front for like a bootlegging operation during the end of Prohibition. And then that closed down or changed its name, maybe to avoid the whatever fallout from the Prohibition era thing was happening. It's really unclear. And he began going by Don Beach, or Don the Beachcomber. He did eventually legally change his name to Don Beach. And Don the Beachcomber, at his Don the Beachcomber restaurants, really created this tiki thing, created these exotic drinks that were theoretically linked to some sort of Polynesian culture that he essentially just made up. So they also had a lot of tiki food, which was all basically sort of Cantonese Chinese food that would just have like an odd garnish on it, and then was supposedly from a Polynesian island. And just that whole tiki aesthetic sort of comes out of that time and place. Anyway, he created a bunch of the early tiki drinks, a lot of really exotic drinks. We talked about in the Mai Tai a little bit how possibly he created something first that Trader Vic was then trying to copy. I don't really think that's true, but it's possible. But this drink he definitely did create, and most sources have it to 1934 that he created it. There's two stories, sort of both that flow from him. And one is just that it's from some menu or something where he explained that this drink took him months and months of just experimenting, and it was really just the culmination of all of his work. Kind of a boring story, but that's probably more true. The other story goes that someone was like in town on some business conference and told him that like they were having a hard time getting through the day, so he made them this drink, the zombie, which then got them going, I guess, but they came back a day or two later and said, that drink turned me into a zombie, like I've been The Walking Dead for two days. I don't know what's been going on and all this stuff. And so they called the drink the zombie in honor of the fact that it's able to make one into a zombie. Whether or not that story's true, it's probably not, but that's a fun story. And so this drink then bounced around. One thing about Don is he was fairly secretive of his recipes, both that he wouldn't share them in general, but even that like recipes written down for the staffs of his various bars and restaurants and things. Some of the ingredients were sort of coded, so there were things called like, spices number 4, which is important to this drink here. I would say it's not spices. I can't think of what the word was, but ingredient number 4, whatever it was called. And so for a long time, we didn't know what that was, right? People had found his recipe and could see the other things. It'd say, rum. You go, okay, I got that. And 10 milliliters of ingredient number 4, which turns out to be cinnamon syrup, by the way. So this was all discovered by Jeff Beachbum Berry, cocktail author and things in more modern times. Interesting guy. He's got a great line of tiki glasses that I don't have any of that I wish I did, because I'm not going to have the right glassware for this drink, but he discovered some of the original sort of writings and things to figure out what the exact mixture of this drink is. And so over the years, zombies were made in a ton of different ways, many of them pretty bad. But the overall recipe that we have in the IBA today, that we have in good sources today, is really close to the 1934 original. Obviously, for a while, they didn't know about the cinnamon syrup. There's very slight proportion tweaks different places. But otherwise, among sort of good sources, there is one source for this drink, and just very slight alterations in fruit juices and things to account for it. But not even types of fruit juice, just like exact proportions and the exact rum selections that you do. But very similar drink, which is cool. We're only going to make one of those this week, though we will make one drink first. Part of the reason for that is just because there's not that much that I want to do with it variant-wise. Like, I think the only real variants are just subbing in rums, and for a couple reasons we're not going to do that. The other thing that this drink's associated with is on some menus historically, it's had a big 2-drink maximum of this drink. This drink, can turn you into a zombie, whatever, which is part of its marketing cred, part of where its sort of cachet comes from. I will say, though, there is some truth to the idea that maybe you should limit yourself to 2 of these, or at least be aware of what they are, because despite the fact that this is a very drinkable drink, at least I think it's going to be, from my recollection of them, I worked out the actual alcohol content of it, and it would be equivalent to having like 5.5 ounces of a regular 80 proof spirit. So, two of those together, that's not insubstantial. Two of those together is, between 1/3 and half of a bottle. So, be aware of it. So for this drink, before we actually make it, there's 2 sort of ingredients we haven't discussed before. The first one I didn't bother filming making. It's just a cinnamon syrup that you then mix with grapefruit juice to create something called Don's Mix. It's weird that they still put that in the IBA, because there's no reason to keep around Don's Mix. Like, just have cinnamon syrup and have grapefruit juice. There's no reason to pre-mix that, but anyway, I already did. But cinnamon syrup, just real quick, just follow our 2-to-1 simple syrup recipe, which we've had in other episodes before, and then when it's done, crack a handful of cinnamon sticks or cassia, depending on what vibe you want, and then let it soak in there for about 24 hours and then strain it out and then bottle it, and that's all you got to do to make cinnamon syrup. The other ingredient is maybe my favorite thing ever, and that is Falernum. Falernum is a sort of mixer of Bajan origin, so from Barbados, supposedly. I'm not entirely sure of the history, but it seems to go back to the early 18th century in some form or another. And it's a very interesting, sweet, but also boozy in and of its own right, and weird spice flavors to it. Really cool product. I did go ahead and film making Falernum. There are a few brands of Falernum out there I should mention. The one that's the go-to is Velvet Falernum. That one I think is fine, and a lot of folks really like that. Before Velvet Falernum came out, pretty much all Falernums you could buy were crap. And so I think there are some other brands now. I don't really play with them. I make my own. This recipe is based on Paul Clark's 8th version of Falernum when he was going through on the Cocktail Chronicles years ago a series of experiments to make Falernum. You can adjust it. There's lots of options to have here, but basically we're going to start off with the soak. So we take about 180 milliliters of J. Ray and Nephew's White Overproof. I don't know if we've ever really used this on the channel before. It's an amazing product. Jamaican pot-stilled rum, unaged, but 126 proof, incredibly funky, weird, awesome product, super flavorful, crazy product. Into that, we want to get the zest off of a whole bunch of limes. I think Paul Clark's recipe is 9, but depending on your lime sizes and whatnot, anywhere from sort of 7 to 10 limes is probably fine, however you want it. So zest all of those into there. Add in a whole bunch of cloves. Again, Paul Clark's recipe I believe is 40. I think in mine there were actually like 43 or something. I don't know. You don't have to count them exactly, just be in that ballpark. Then I added in a couple of pimentos of allspice berries. That's optional. I don't believe that's in Paul Clark's recipe. I like throwing 1 or 2 in there. If you want more of that flavor, throw in more, or crack them in half first. Totally up to you. Then also some folks throw in some toasted almond slivers here to get that into the soak. I didn't, but I have before. That works. Lots of other little, some folks put cinnamon in here. I don't, but again, you're welcome to. And then also we put in a bunch of, I don't even know what order I shot this in, so this might be out of order, but a whole bunch of ginger peeled and sliced up. We're then going to seal up the jar with obviously the correct lid and not a piece of cling film, because somehow I have a million wide mouth lids sitting around but no narrow mouth lids, so we won't do that for sure. But then we're going to let that sit for at least 24 hours. You can take it longer. I've left it 48 before. You get out a little more flavor, but if you've gotten any pith in your zest, any of the white bits, the longer you leave it, the more sort of unpleasantly bitter it will become. So bear that in mind. 24, 30 hours is probably about right. We're going to go ahead and make a 2-to-1 simple syrup. I followed Paul Clark here and did it cold process, which is where you just manually shake the heck out of it. There's this very slight difference in taste doing it that way. I'm not sure it's worth it. Making it hot process is easier, but whatever. And then we're going to add to that both our concoction, our soak, and then we're going to also add some almond extract and a whole bunch of lime juice. So using all those limes that we zested earlier, I think we put in 160 milliliters of lime juice, thereabouts. And that's basically it. And so then you have Falernum, which is this funky, boozy, very sweet, whole bunch of clove, whole bunch of lime, just a crazy, fresh, zingy concoction that I think is amazing. There is enough perishable stuff in there, enough lime, that this is not one you can keep for, years. I'd say you get a good month out of it in the fridge, but, probably not too much longer than that, but do what you like with it. So we're going to start off by making a corn and oil. And a corn and oil is actually the drink that is in the logo picture that's on my screen behind me and is my avatar on YouTube and stuff. It's not a drink that's on the IBA list, at least I sure don't think it is, or else I'm screwing up a future episode. But the corn and oil is a very simple drink of Bajan origin, which I'm going to screw up here by not using a Bajan rum, which we'll get to in a minute. It's actually the rum I wanted for my Zombie 2, but they were out of it. So we're going to use totally the wrong rum for this. It's still going to be good. All right, so very simply in a mixing glass here with some ice, I'm going to put a couple dashes of Ango. .45 milliliters, about 1.5 ounces of an aged rum. This is Bacardí 8. This is not ideal. I really like Mount Gay XO in here, but as I said, I ran to the store earlier and they were out of it. So we're using Bacardí 8. It'll be fine. And the wonderful Falernum that we made the other day. I'm gonna give that just a little shake, make sure we're all incorporated. I'm gonna put in about 22, 23 milliliters, so about 3/4 of an ounce. You can totally vary this to your taste. I've seen recipes as rich as 1:1, and I've seen it incredibly dry the other way. Do it however makes sense to you. Then we're just gonna give that a nice stir. This is typically served over cracked ice, occasionally crushed ice. I like it just over a big cube, but that's just me. And then sometimes in more modern versions, people will do then a float of a black rum, like a blackstrap, Goslings, that kind of thing. That is not traditional, but the idea is that that gives the and oil look, like there's an oil slick on top of the drink. That's not really why it's called that. It's actually a biblical reference to passage in Deuteronomy, I believe. And this is also a drink that goes back hundreds of years to back when Falernum was new in Barbados, probably, according to some. Let's give a try to a corn and oil. Oh, so that nose. Bunch of lime, but there's also a weird, spicy, funky thing underneath. Yeah, so good. It's weird because the front of the tongue is lime. Sharp, tart, great. We know kind of what we're in for. Then immediately it is almost too sweet. There's so much simple syrup in there, incredibly sweet, very sugary, which then immediately starts to fade as I get all that rum happening right behind it. And then I'm reading the rum with a little bit of integration from, the clove, from, that kind of stuff, from some of the inherent weird, banana flavors of the Wray and Nephew, all come right in that ending with the rum itself. And this is where, again, a better rum, a more flavorful rum can really stand out here. And should really lead you to figure out the right amount of Falernum to use to, hit that balance right, depending on the rum you're using. Yeah, I'd say with the Bacardí 8, I'd cut the Falernum back even more. If I were making this again in the future, I'd cut that back to 15 milliliters to a 45 milliliter pour of the rum. But this is still just delicious. One of my all-time favorite drinks. So simple, so tasty. So as I mentioned earlier, as we move on to the zombie itself, most good recipes from the IBA, from somewhere like Difford's Guide, from Smuggler's Cove, which we'll talk about in a minute, from other, decent sources, all have the recipe very similar and pretty much, correct. I don't love the way the IBA calls the rums necessarily. So they call for 45 milliliters of a Jamaican dark rum, 45 milliliters of a gold Puerto Rico rum, and 30 milliliters of a Demerara rum. I don't think these things are entirely clear to what you need. So when they say a dark Jamaican rum, that to me could be a lot of different things. What they, I think, mean is a Jamaican rum with some fairly substantial age on it. When they say gold Puerto Rican rum, again, I think that they mean has some age on it, not as Bacardí Gold, which I've seen used in this before for some reason. And then when they say Demerara rum, that's a whole family of rums, of course, from Guyana. And what they mean is an overproof Demerara rum. So the go-to here would be Lemon Hart 151. I don't have any Lemon Hart 151. I don't really have any of the right things for this drink, but that's okay. So in Smuggler's Cove, which we've mentioned before as sort of the resource for exotic tiki sort of drink learning, I really like the way that they break these down. So they call for a blended aged rum, a column still aged rum, and a black blended overproof rum. And then they explain obviously other places in the book what all that means. But that to me is a much better idea of what we need for this drink. So for our blended aged rum, we've got Denizen's Merchant Reserve. This is mostly an 8-year-old Jamaican pot stilled rum mixed with 20% of a Martinique black rum. Blended, aged, good. Then blended column still rum. I don't think we've ever talked about different kinds of stills. I'm not going to waste more time on it here, but column stills basically make things less complex. Pot stills make things more complex. So the Jamaican, pot still. Puerto Rico, generally column still. Maybe we'll explain it in a future episode. So we have the Bacardí 8. This is an aged column still rum. And then for our overproof, which the IBA just called for Demerara, which I think is a bad example of that. Lemon Hart 151 would be amazing here. I just don't have it. So we're going to use the Plantation OFTD. This is a 130 some proof Jamaican and Bajan and Guianan rum. So there is Demerara rum in here. It's all pot still, incredibly overproof. There's Bajan rum in there. It's awesome. I think it's actually made in Barbados. So technically, we finally brought a Bajan component here. That's what I wanted in place of this. Is I wanted the Mount Gay XO, just like I would have wanted for the corn and oil. But all right, very last note, and then I promise I'm going to start making the zombie. If you see the shaker tins here and you know this drink pretty well, you might be wondering what I'm doing. What I'm doing is making it incorrectly. IBA calls for the whole thing to be thrown into a blender, which I think is a terrible approach. The better way to do it is how Smuggler Cove calls to do it, which is to flash blend it, which is to use one of those like milkshake maker looking machines. They have just a tiny little, bit on the bottom that agitates, and you put in ice that's already crushed and then just flash it for a second. That's the way to do it if I had one of those. So instead we're gonna crush some ice and shake it. It's gonna be fine, don't worry about it. Okay, so into our shaker tins. We're gonna start off with the ingredient that if we had too much of it, everything would be ruined. And that is absinthe. Technically in the IBA spec, they call for Pernod, which is a pastis. It's like a non-absinthe absinthe from back when absinthe was illegal for a while. I don't have that. I'm not getting that. That's no good. We want 6 drops, which I don't have this in a dropper, but is not much. That's a great amount. That will really color and overtake the drink if you go much heavier than that. I'd say half a bar spoon would be the absolute maximum that you would want in there. Then we want some mango, 1 or 2 dashes of that. Then we'll do our sort of mixers. So this is the Don's mix that I mentioned earlier. This is a mixture of cinnamon syrup with grapefruit juice. I want 15 milliliters, or about half an ounce of that. Wow, that smells really good. About 15 milliliters or half an ounce of our Falernum. A bar spoon of our Grenadine syrup, which we made on the show before. Now we'll make it healthy by adding some lime juice. We've got 20 milliliters, or about 2/3 of a fluid ounce. And now it is time for our spirits. 45 milliliters of our blended aged sort of Jamaican or Bajan or something in that general vibe. "45 milliliters of our aged column still rum, so something Puerto Rican or similar, but with at least 8 years or so of age on it. Longer could be even nicer. And finally, 30 milliliters of our Overproof. Something preferably, at least 140 proof or so. Lemon Hart 151 or some other Demerara rum would be traditional. Something like the Plantation OFTD will certainly work. Then we're going to go ahead and crush up some ice. I'm not going to go super fine. I just want it all very cracked, but I don't need a powder. We're just gonna give that a very quick little shake. And then I mentioned earlier glassware. There's a specific zombie glass. It looks sort of like a highball glass, but it's slightly wider and tends to have cool art of like zombies and things on it. Don't have one. I think a highball glass that I have is gonna be just a little small. So I'm just gonna grab this kind of boring pint glass. Good. Glass is ugly, but the proportion, spot on. Then garnish is very simple. Some folks put limes in it, other things, but mint is sort of the traditional. Couple sprigs of mint there. I'm just gonna pop a straw in there as well. And that, although all slightly wrong, is proportionally an IBA spec zombie. Obviously a lot of mint, weird sort of sweetness, brown sugary, you know, it's the rums, it's the Falernum, mint, all kind of happening together there, spicy sweetness. I mean, that's just delicious. You know, I mean, you can definitely taste that there's booze in it, but if you like something like a Mai Tai, you're gonna love this. It's just a great balanced drink. Let me try to give you flavor notes, but there's so much happening. Yeah, so I again start lime, nice tart pop, but now that's slightly elongated. I think it's like the Grenadine or something in there, the grapefruit, some combination of flavors. It starts very sharp and then gets slightly bigger and then stays underneath the whole time as suddenly we work through the rums, and they come in sort of two separate waves. There's one that's very strong, burnt sugar, dark, slightly alcohol-y, a little bit of burn. That's a mixture of the Denizen and the Plantation. And then it goes to a slightly softer place. You taste almost a hint of wood, a little bit of a mellow thing. Just the hint of funk coming in that middle point, and then it sort of fades off, gets slightly sweeter, and I'm left with that beautiful limey thing ringing out underneath. It's so well integrated. The Falernum really brings that lime, but gives you those spice notes that really work right in the middle of that rum to just make it this sort of caramelly, burnt sugar place, a little bit of funk, a little bit of spice. This drink rules. Well, thanks so much for coming along on this week's zombie adventure. If you've never tried one, I would highly recommend it. I know that making your own Falernum is a bit of a chore, and your own cinnamon syrup, and your own Grenadine. So I realize there's a lot of steps involved to make this one well at home, but definitely if you're at a bar that you trust, have them make one for you. And if you're into it, so worth making all those things, especially the Falernum. It's just the best. And this is, like I said, a great place to play, both in that Falernum recipe with how you add spices to the soak and stuff, but also the rums here. I think it's important to kind of represent these three types of rum, but within each family there are a million things you could do in terms of going with less age, more age, different islands, different sort of sugar compositions. So many places to play here. This is certainly not what I'm signing off as the best way to make a zombie. I've made better zombies, but this is a really great place to start. If you visit the blog at shakingandsipping.com, we'll have a write-up on this and each other drink. Some weeks we also have IBA in real life, where we go to a local Seattle cocktail bar and try out the drink. Not sure if we're doing that yet this week, but check back on the blog to see. This is where I'd normally say we'll be back next week with the next drink from the IBA's list, but that's not true. We'll be back next week with a little recap video of this segment of the IBA drinks. After that, we'll probably take a couple weeks off, and then we will eventually be started in the third section. Thanks so much to everyone who's been along so far. We'll be back next week with a video, and until then, happy sipping. Cheers.